Victor Hale pressed the muzzle of his pistol against the forehead of a bound American intelligence officer and smiled at the camera he knew Washington was watching. "You sent your best," he said, his voice calm as still water. "And I sent them home in boxes. Come again, please. I have plenty of room in the ground for heroes." Then he pulled the trigger beside the man's ear, laughed at the flinch, and cut the feed. Before we go any further, if a story about courage, sacrifice, and the one person nobody believed in means something to you, take a second and subscribe to the channel, and stay with me all the way to the end, because the truth about what rose out of that river will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. Now let me take you back to the beginning. The command tent on a ridgeline above the Columbia River smelled like burnt coffee and fear, and Commander Ethan Brooks had spent enough years in tents like this one to know the difference between the two. Fear had a weight to it. It pressed down on a man's shoulders, and right now, every shoulder in that tent was carrying it. "Play it again," Brooks said. The young analyst hesitated. "Sir, you've watched it 4 times. Play it again." The screen flickered, and there was Victor Hale's face once more. That unhurried smile, that steady hand, that pistol against a man's forehead. Brooks watched the whole thing without blinking. He watched the flinch, he watched the laugh, and when the feed cut to black, he stood there in silence, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. 8 of them, he finally said. 8 American officers, and this animal is executing them one at a time on camera to make a point. "We don't know that the shot was real, sir," someone offered. "It could have been staged. The round could have gone wide on purpose. And if it wasn't," Brooks turned around slowly, "you want to be the one to explain to that man's wife that we assumed it was a bluff? No. We planned for the worst every time. That's how we've always done it." But that was exactly the problem, and Brooks knew it. Every time, every single time they had gone after Victor Hale, they had done it the way they had always done it. And every single time, Hale had been 3 steps ahead of them. He walked to the map table and put both hands flat on the surface, staring down at the compound they had been studying for 11 days. A converted lodge sitting on a bend in the river deep in the Oregon wilderness. Guard towers, patrol routes, thermal countermeasures. The man had turned a hunting lodge into a fortress, and he'd done it while laughing at them the whole time. 2 teams, Brooks said quietly. 2 teams we've already lost trying to take this place. Good men, better men than me. And Hale swatted them out of the sky like they were nothing. "Sir," Master Chief Daniel Reyes stepped up beside him. Reyes was the closest thing Brooks had to a conscience, a man who'd been kicking down doors since before some of these young operators were born. "You keep saying we did it the way we always do it. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe it's time we did it a way we've never done it before." Brooks looked at him, meaning. Reyes didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the tent flap, toward a figure standing just outside in the cold arms folded waiting to be called in. Meaning maybe you should hear what the lieutenant has to say. Brooks followed his gaze, and his face hardened. "Reyes, just hear her out, Commander. I've read her file. Reading a file and hearing a person are 2 different things, and you know it." Brooks was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed the sigh of a man who'd run out of good options. "Bring her in." The tent flap opened, and Lieutenant Maya Carter stepped inside. She was smaller than most of them expected, and Brooks watched the reaction ripple across the tent the way it always did. The slight straightening of spines, the quick dismissive glances that men gave when they had already made up their minds. She was 29 years old, and she carried herself with a stillness that made the loud, restless energy of the tent feel suddenly cheap. "Lieutenant Carter," Brooks said, "you requested this briefing. I'll be honest with you, I don't know why." "Because you've lost 2 teams, sir," Maya said. Her voice was even, no tremor, no performance. "And you're about to send a 3rd. The tent went very quiet. "That's a hell of a thing to say to a room full of men who buried their friends this week," a voice snapped from the corner. It belonged to Petty Officer Cole Whitman, broad-shouldered, jaw-tight eyes already burning. "You want to tell us how we're doing it wrong, Lieutenant Rowe? You've never even been downrange with this unit." "I'm not here to tell you what you did wrong," Maya said, turning to face him without flinching. "I'm here to tell you why it keeps happening. Victor Hale isn't beating you because he's smarter than you. He's beating you because he knows exactly what you're going to do before you do it. And how would you know that? Because I've spent 11 days reading the same file you have. And every approach in that file is one Hale has already planned for. Helicopters, he hears coming. Ground assault, he sees the moment your first boot crosses the tree line. Sniper overwatch, he's got counter snipers pre-sighted on every position tall enough to shoot from. She paused. He's not defending a compound. He's running a trap. And you keep walking into it because you keep coming from the directions a soldier is supposed to come from. Whitman opened his mouth, but Brooks raised a hand. Go on, Lieutenant. Maya stepped up to the map table. She didn't ask permission. She just placed a single finger on the blue line winding past the compound. The river. Whitman actually laughed. The river, that water's 40 degrees and it's running fast enough to drag a truck downstream. Nobody's coming from the river. That's exactly why it's the one direction he isn't watching, Maya said. He's covered every approach a rational person would take, so I'll take the one that isn't rational. Brooks stared at her. Explain. I go in alone, underwater, dive gear closed, circuit, rebreather, no bubbles, no signature. I move upriver in the dark, past his patrols, past his thermal, and I hold at the bend below the compound. From there, I have a firing lane to the main structure. She looked up, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that wasn't calm at all. It was fire. I take out Hale and his counter sniper before your assault team ever moves. By the time he understands what's happening, the hostages are already coming home. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Whitman shook his head slowly. You're insane. Maybe. You'd be in that water for hours, alone, no support, no extraction if it goes wrong. If your gear fails, you drown and nobody even knows where your body went. I know, Maya said simply. And that was the thing that got to Brooks. Not the plan. He'd heard crazy plans before. It was the way she said, I know. No bravado, no trembling. Just a woman who had already looked her own death in the face and made peace with it before she ever walked into that tent. Why you? Brooks asked. Because I can hold my breath and my nerve longer than anybody else on this base, and because I'm the only one who's willing to say it out loud. She met his eyes. And because if I'm wrong, sir, you only lose me. If you send another team the old way, you lose all of them. I've done the math. One life is a better bet than 12. The tent was dead silent. Brooks turned away from her and walked back to the flap, staring out at the black ribbon of the river far below. And for a long time, he said nothing at all. Whitman broke the silence, and his voice was lower now, less angry, more raw. Commander, with respect, you can't seriously be considering handing this entire operation to one bullet from one shooter we've never worked with. Maya answered before Brooks could. No, she said quietly, and every head turned toward her. You're not being asked to trust one bullet. You're being asked to trust the person behind it. Something passed through the tent then. Not agreement, not yet, but something shifted. Whitman looked away first. Brooks finally turned back around. You've got a lot of confidence for someone who's never proven herself to this unit. I'm not asking for your confidence, sir, Maya said. I'm asking for your permission. The confidence I'll earn in the water. Brooks studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes, who gave the smallest of nods. And he looked at the map at the two red marks that meant dead teams and dead men, and at the compound sitting there like a spider at the center of a web. Get some rest, Lieutenant, Brooks said. I'll have a decision by 2200. Maya nodded once and turned to leave. But at the tent flap she stopped, and without turning around, she said something that Brooks would remember for the rest of his life. There are 8 people in that compound, sir, who think everyone has forgotten them. I haven't. And I'd rather die in that river reminding them than live the rest of my life knowing I stayed dry. Then she was gone out into the cold, and the tent felt smaller without her in it. For a long while, nobody spoke. Then Whitman muttered, she's going to get herself killed. Reyes looked at him. Probably, but answer me this, Cole. When's the last time you heard anybody in this outfit talk about the hostages by name? By number, we've been talking about the compound for 11 days. Approaches, firing angles, thermal countermeasures. She walked in here, and the first thing out of her mouth was the 8 people we're actually supposed to be saving. He shook his head. Maybe that woman's crazy, but maybe crazy is exactly what we've been missing. Whitman didn't answer. Outside in the dark, Maya Carter sat alone on a fallen log with her elbows on her knees, and for the first time all day, she let herself feel it. The fear because she wasn't fearless. She had never been fearless. She just learned a long time ago that fear was a passenger you could carry without letting it drive. She thought about her father, a Marine who'd come home from 3 wars with a limp and a silence he never explained. She thought about the day she told him she was going to try out for the SEALs and how he hadn't laughed, hadn't argued, hadn't told her it was impossible. He just looked at her for a long time and said, "The hard part isn't proving it to them, Maya. The hard part is proving it to yourself when there's nobody left in the room to see it." She'd never forgotten that. There's nobody left in the room to see it. In a few hours, she was going to be in the coldest, blackest water she'd ever known, completely alone, and there would be nobody left in the room to see it. Just her and the fear and the 8 strangers she'd decided were worth dying for. Footsteps crunched toward her in the dark. She looked up. It was Whitman. He stood there awkwardly for a second, his big hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "I was hard on you in there," he said. "You were honest," Maya said. "That's different." He sat down on the log, a careful distance away. For a while, neither of them spoke. The river hissed somewhere below. "My brother was on the first team," Whitman said finally. His voice cracked on the word brother, and he swallowed hard before he went on. "Younger than me. I'm the one who talked him into the teams. And Hale put him in the ground 3 days ago." He stared out into the dark. "So when you walked in there and started explaining how we did it wrong, I wanted to put my hands around your throat. You understand?" "I understand," Maya said quietly. "But then you said that thing about the hostages thinking everyone forgot them." He shook his head slowly. "And I realize I've spent 3 days so angry about my brother that I forgot there are 8 people in that lodge who've got a brother, a wife, a kid somewhere praying we haven't quit." He turned to look at her. "So I'll tell you what, I still think your plan's insane, but if the commander says go, I'll be on that assault team and I will move the second you give the word. You get us the opening, I'll get the door." Maya looked at him and something in her chest loosened just slightly. "Deal." Whitman stood up, but before he walked away, he said one more thing. "That counter sniper Hale's got, he's not just some hired gun. Intel says he's ex-military. Real ex-military. The kind that doesn't miss." He paused. "You point that rifle at Hale, you'd better take him first shot because you won't get a second one. That other shooter will have you pinned before your brass hits the water." Maya nodded slowly. "First shot," she said. "Understood." Whitman walked away into the dark, and Maya sat alone again, turning that over in her mind. First shot, 1 bullet for Hale, and 1 heartbeat later, 1 bullet for a professional killer who would already be hunting for her muzzle flash. 2 impossible shots. No margin. No second chances. At 2,158, Reyes found her still sitting on the log. "Commander wants you." She stood. Inside the tent, Brooks was standing over the map, and when she came in, he didn't waste words. "I've made my decision." He looked at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not confidence, something closer to guilt. "I'm going to let you do this." Maya nodded. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me." Brooks's voice was rough. "I want you to understand something, Lieutenant. I'm not doing this because I believe in your plan. I'm doing this because I've run out of plans I do believe in, and that's the God's honest truth. So don't you go into that water thinking you've got a commander who's sure about you. You've got a commander who's desperate. There's a difference, and you deserve to know it." Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "With respect, sir, I don't need you to be sure about me. I've got enough sure for both of us." And for the first time in 11 days, Ethan Brooks almost smiled. "Wheels up is 2,300, he said. "You'll insert 3 miles downriver. From there, you're on your own until you're in position. We won't be able to talk to you. We won't be able to help you. If it goes wrong down there, Lieutenant, there is nothing any of us can do." He paused. "Are you sure you want this?" Maya looked around the tent at Reyes at Whitman, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, and all the men who doubted her an hour ago and were now watching her like she was the last light in a very dark room. "Sir," she said, "I've been sure since before I walked in here." The next hour moved fast. Gear check, rebreather test, the long, careful ritual of a sniper preparing her rifle, cleaning it, checking it, cleaning it again, the way another person might pray. Maya worked in silence, and the men gave her space, and every now and then one of them would glance at her and then look away, and she knew what they were thinking because she'd have been thinking it too. She's not coming back. At 2,247, Reyes came and crouched beside her. He'd been a SEAL for 22 years, and he'd sent a lot of young people into the dark. Can I tell you something, Lieutenant? Always Master Chief. When I first read your file, I thought exactly what all of them thought. He nodded toward the men. I thought, no way. Not alone. Not this mission. He was quiet for a second. And then I read the part where you scored higher on the sniper course than anybody in the last 9 years. And I thought, huh. And then I met you tonight and I watched you stand in a tent full of grieving men and tell them the truth they didn't want to hear. And I stopped thinking about whether you could do it. He looked at her. You want to know what I think now? What do you think, Master Chief? I think Victor Hale has planned for everything a soldier would do. He put a heavy hand on her shoulder. But he's never planned for you. And that lieutenant is going to be the last mistake that man ever makes. Maya held his gaze and something passed between them. Old soldier and young that didn't need any more words. Get those 8 people home, Reyes said and stood up. Everything else is noise. At 2300, they loaded her into the boat. The engine was muffled, the lights were off, and the men who doubted her stood on the bank and watched her go without a word. Whitman was the last thing she saw before the dark swallowed the shore. He raised one hand. Not a wave. A promise. I'll be there. Give me the opening. Maya raised her hand back. Then the boat pushed off into the current, and the last lights of the friendly world slid away behind her, and Lieutenant Maya Carter was alone. The river was louder than she'd expected. It moved with a low, constant growl, and she could feel the cold coming off it, even through her gear. A cold that promised it would find every seam and gap it could and steal the warmth right out of her body. 3 miles downriver, the boat cut its engine and drifted, and one of the crew touched her shoulder. This was it. Maya sat on the edge of the boat and looked up at the sky one last time. It was a clear night. She could see stars. She thought about her father and the thing he'd said. The hard part is proving it to yourself when there's nobody left in the room to see it. Well, Dad, she thought, there's nobody left in the room now. She fitted her mask, checked her rebreather, one final time, took a slow breath of the strange dry air the machine gave her, and rolled backward off the boat into the black water. The cold hit her like a fist. It slammed the breath out of her lungs and clamped down on her chest and screamed at every nerve in her body to turn around, to climb out, to go back to the warm. Maya hung there in the darkness for one long, terrible second, fighting the animal panic that came with immersion in water. That cold, and then the way she'd trained 10,000 times, she pushed it down, made it a passenger, took the wheel. Then she turned her body upstream toward the compound, toward Victor Hale, toward 8 strangers who were waiting for a ghost, and she began to swim. Above her, the current churned, and the world went on patrols, walking the shoreline, thermal cameras sweeping the trees, a killer sleeping soundly in a fortress he believed no one could touch. And beneath all of it, silent, unseen, unbelieved in one small figure moved through the freezing dark, carrying a rifle and a fear she refused to obey. Nobody in that compound knew she was coming. Nobody on that riverbank could have imagined it. And 3 miles behind her on a cold ridgeline, Commander Ethan Brooks stood staring down at the water she had vanished into and said the only thing left to say. God go with you, Lieutenant. The river carried his voice away, and Maya Carter swam on into the dark. Sao các bạn nghìn năm trăm từ? Bạn nói đúng phần vừa rồi chưa đạt đủ số từ yêu cầu 4.000 đến 4.500 từ. Tôi sẽ viết bổ sung để hoàn thiện part 1 cho đủ độ dài. Đây là phần tiếp nối liền mạch với đoạn kết ở trên, giữ nguyên phong cách kể chuyện, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động tâm lý và đối thoại. The water was a living thing and it wanted her dead. Maya learned that in the first 10 minutes. The current pushed against her with a patience that was almost cruel. Never letting up, never tiring, and for every 3 strokes she took upstream, she lost 1 to the pull, dragging her back toward the sea. Her muscles burned. The cold had already crept past the outer layers of her gear and was working on her hands, turning her fingers into clumsy, half-dead things she had to trust more than feel. She counted her breaths. It was the only thing that kept the fear from climbing back into the driver's seat. In through the rebreather, slow, controlled. Out, in, out. Every breath was a small victory, a reminder that she was still alive, still moving, still her father's daughter. She thought about that word Whitman had thrown at her in the tent. Insane. Maybe he was right. Maybe a sane person would have stayed on the ridgeline where it was safe. But Maya had stopped believing in that kind of safe a long time ago. There was no safe. There was only the choice between the fear you ran from and the fear you swam into, and she had made her choice years before she ever entered that water. A light swept across the surface above her, and she froze. She hung suspended in the black current, willing herself to become nothing, a stone, a shadow, a piece of the river itself. The beam of the patrol's flashlight cut down through the water and painted the world above her in a sick yellow glow, and Maya watched it move, watched it search, watched it hunt for exactly the thing she was. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she was certain they could hear it on the shore. Come on, she thought. Look somewhere else. Look anywhere else. The light lingered, held, and then after what felt like a lifetime, it moved on, sweeping down the bank, searching for a threat it would never think to look for beneath its own feet. Maya exhaled slowly and let herself sink another foot deeper. Hale's men were good, disciplined. They walked their routes with the confidence of people who believed they had thought of everything. And that confidence, Maya knew, was going to be the death of them, because the one thing they had never thought of was a woman in the water beneath their boots. She swam on. Time did strange things down there in the dark. Minutes stretched into hours and hours collapsed into single, endless moments. She had no idea how long she'd been in the water. Long enough that the cold had stopped screaming and started whispering, which was worse because the whisper was seductive. It told her to rest. It told her she was doing fine, that she could stop for just a second, close her eyes, let the current hold her. Maya knew that whisper. It was the voice of the cold trying to kill her gently, and she answered it the only way she knew how. She kept moving. She thought about the 8 of them. She'd read their files too, the same way she'd read everything else. 8 names, 8 faces, 8 people with mothers and fathers and children who were right now in this exact moment, lying awake in the dark somewhere praying that their country hadn't given up. One of them was a father of 3. One of them was 24 years old on his first assignment. One of them had a wife who was pregnant with a child he might never meet. Hale saw them as leverage, cards to be played, bodies to be executed on camera to make Washington flinch. But Maya had memorized their names on purpose because she needed them to be real to her. She needed to feel the weight of them. She needed, in the moment when the cold and the fear and the exhaustion were telling her to quit, to have 8 human faces to swim toward. 24 years old, first assignment, a wife with a baby coming. She swam on. A cramp seized her left calf, a vicious knot of pain that nearly doubled her over in the water. And for one terrifying moment, she felt the current get a real grip on her and start to turn her. Maya fought it. She reached down with fingers she could barely feel and dug them into the cramping muscle and forced it to release, forced it to obey, the whole time drifting backward, losing precious yards she'd fought so hard to win. When the cramp finally let go, she was breathing hard, her nerves jangling, and she had to stop and simply hold her position against the current until her heart slowed down. "You're all right," she told herself. "You're all right. Keep counting. In, out, in, out." She kept counting, and somewhere in that endless dark, a strange calm settled over her, the calm that had frightened Brooks in the tent. It wasn't the absence of fear. The fear was still there, would always be there. It was something underneath the fear, something older and steadier, the thing her father had carried home from 3 wars in his silence. It was the simple bedrock certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, and that whatever happened next, she would not have to spend her life wondering whether she'd been brave enough. That was the thing nobody understood about her. They thought courage was the absence of fear. It wasn't. Maya was more afraid than any of them. She was just less willing to let her fear make her decisions. The compound was close now. She could feel it more than see it, a heaviness in the water, a change in the current where the riverbank curved. She checked her depth, checked her heading, and began to angle toward the bend she'd marked on the map a lifetime ago, in a warm tent with living men around her. And that was when she heard it. Not with her ears exactly, but through the water itself, a low vibration, the sound of an engine, a boat moving out onto the river above her. Maya went still. A patrol boat. Hale had put a patrol boat on the water. It hadn't been in any of the intel. It was new. It was a variable she hadn't planned for, and it was heading slowly, methodically, right toward the stretch of river she needed to cross. Her mind raced through the options and found them all bad. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't fight it, not from the water, not without giving herself away. She could go deeper, but the river wasn't deep here, and a boat with a spotlight and a thermal scope would find a diver in shallow water the way a hawk finds a rabbit in an open field. The engine drew closer. She could hear voices now muffled and distorted through the water, men calling to each other, unhurried, bored, doing a job they'd done 100 times and never once found anything. Maya made her decision. She let herself sink all the way to the riverbed down into the silt and the cold and the dark, and she wedged herself against a submerged rock, and she made herself as flat and as still as a corpse. The rebreather was silent, no bubbles, no signature, but the thermal was the danger. Her body was warmer than the water. To a thermal scope, she would glow like a coal in the dark. Unless the water hit her, unless the moving current in the churned silt in the cold, cold river confused the heat of her just enough. It was a gamble. It was the whole mission balanced on a single freezing gamble. The boat came over her. Maya lay against the rock and watched the black shape of the hull slide across the surface above her. Watched the spotlight stab down into the water on either side of her, and she did the hardest thing a human being can do. She did nothing. She held perfectly, absolutely still, while a boat full of men who would kill her without a thought passed directly over her body, hunting for exactly the ghost she was. The spotlight swung her way. The beam cut down through the water toward her, and Maya closed her eyes because there was nothing else to do, and she thought not with panic, but with a strange, distant clarity. So this is where it happens. And she thought of her father and of the 8 names and of Whitman standing on the bank with his hand raised in a promise, and she made herself ready. The beam swept over her and moved on. The boat's engine faded, the voices grew distant. The thermal, confused by the cold and the current and the silt, had passed her by. Maya lay on the riverbed for a full minute after the boat was gone, not daring to move, her whole body shaking now from the cold and from the adrenaline and from the sheer animal relief of still being alive. Then she pushed off the rock and kept going. She reached the bend at last. She had no way to know how long she'd been in the water, only that it had been long enough that she wasn't entirely sure she could feel her own body anymore. She rose slowly, carefully, until just the top of her head and the barrel of her rifle broke the surface in the deep shadow of the overhanging bank. And for the first time in hours, Maya Carter looked out at the world with her own eyes. The compound was right where the map said it would be. 600 meters upriver, the lodge sat on its bend, lit by scattered lights, ringed by its guard towers, breathing with the quiet menace of a fortress that had never been breached. She could see figures moving on the walls. She could see the glow of a cigarette in a tower. And somewhere inside that structure were 8 people who had no idea that their country had just sent a single frozen woman through 3 miles of killing river to bring them home. Maya settled into her firing position, her body half in the water. Her rifle steadied on the bank, and she began the long, patient work of getting ready. She checked her scope. She read the wind, the way it moved the grass on the far bank, the way it carried the smoke from that cigarette. She calculated distance and drop and drift, running the numbers, the way she'd run them 10,000 times before letting the math push the last of the fear and the cold out of her mind. 600 meters, crosswind light quartering. She built a shot in her head, and then she built it again, and then she waited. Because that was the thing they never told you about being a sniper. It wasn't about the shot. The shot was 1 second out of 100,000. It was about the waiting. It was about lying half frozen in a black river for hours, holding, perfectly still, holding your nerve, holding your whole self together through the cold and the fear and the crushing loneliness, waiting for one single moment that might never even come. And Maya Carter was very, very good at waiting. She thought about Brooks back on the ridgeline, standing over a map, not knowing if she was alive or dead. She thought about Whitman and his assault team geared up in the dark, waiting for a signal they weren't sure they'd ever receive. She thought about the 8 names, and she thought about the man she'd come to kill. Victor Hale, American-born, a man who had taken every gift his country gave him and turned it into a weapon aimed at that same country's heart. A man who executed prisoners on camera and laughed. A man who was at this very moment sleeping soundly behind his walls, absolutely certain that he had thought of everything that no soldier alive could touch him. He had thought of everything a soldier would do. He had never once in all his careful planning thought of a woman in the water. Maya adjusted her grip on the rifle and settled deeper into her stillness and let her breathing slow until it was almost nothing at all. And she fixed her eyes on the lodge and its lights and its walls, and she waited for Victor Hale to make the last mistake of his life. Somewhere behind her, 3 miles down a river that had tried its best to kill her, a commander who didn't believe in her was praying she was still alive. Somewhere ahead of her, 8 strangers were waiting for a ghost. And all around her, in the cold and the dark and the silence, an entire compound of armed men slept soundly, never dreaming that death itself had risen out of their own river and was lying patient in the shadows watching, breathing ready. The wind shifted. The compound stirred. And Lieutenant Maya Carter tightened her finger against the guard of her trigger and became at last completely and perfectly still. The ghost had arrived. She waited, and the waiting almost broke her. An hour passed, then another. The cold had stopped being pain and become something worse, a heaviness, a slowness in her thoughts that Maya recognized and feared more than any bullet. She knew what it was. She'd been trained to know. Her body was giving up before her will was, and if she let it, she would simply fade out here in the dark, 600 meters from 8 people who were counting on a ghost that never came. So she fought it the only way she could. She talked to herself silently inside the small warm room that was left of her mind. Stay. Just stay. One more minute. Give me one more minute. And when that minute was gone, she asked herself for another and another, buying her own life back, one breath at a time. And then at last, the compound stirred. A light came on in the main structure that hadn't been on before. Maya's eyes snapped into focus, the sluggishness burning away in an instant. Through her scope, she watched a door open, watched 2 armed men step out onto the platform that ran along the front of the lodge, and watched them take up positions like men expecting company. Her heart began to climb. Something was happening. Then Victor Hale walked out into the light. She knew him instantly. She'd studied that face for 11 days, that unhurried walk, that way he had of moving like a man who owned every inch of ground he stood on. He came to the railing and he lit a cigarette, and he looked out at the black river, at the very water she was hiding in, and for one heart-stopping moment, Maya was certain he was looking directly at her. He wasn't. He couldn't be. But she felt it anyway, that gaze passing over her hiding place, and it took everything she had not to flinch. Take the shot, a voice in her screamed. He's right there, take it. But Maya didn't move because Whitman's warning was louder than the voice. That counter-sniper Hale's got. He's ex-military, the real kind. You point that rifle at Hale, you'd better take him first shot because you won't get a second one. She swept her scope slowly across the compound, hunting, looking for the one thing she needed to find before she could pull that trigger. The counter-sniper. Because the moment she killed Hale, that other shooter would be hunting her muzzle, and if she didn't know where he was, she was already dead. She couldn't find him. Tower 1, empty except for a bored guard. Tower 2, 2 men, neither of them a sniper. The roof line, nothing. The tree line behind the lodge, shadows and more shadows. Maya's pulse hammered as the seconds bled away. Hale standing there smoking a perfect target, and she could not take the shot because she could not find the man who would kill her the instant she did. Where are you, she thought. Where are you hiding? And then Hale did something that changed everything. He turned and he called out to someone inside the doorway, and he said a name. Cutter. Just loud enough to carry on the still night air across the water. Cutter, get out here. A man stepped out of the doorway, and Maya's blood went cold in a way the river never had. She knew him too. She hadn't just studied Hale for 11 days. She'd studied everyone connected to him, every associate, every hired gun, every face in every file. And this face she knew from a different file entirely, an older one from a life she'd left behind. Because the man Hale called Cutter, the professional killer with the rifle who was going to hunt her the second she fired, was a man named Raymond Cutter. And Raymond Cutter had been her instructor. 3 years ago at the sniper course, before he'd been quietly discharged for reasons nobody would talk about, Raymond Cutter had taught Maya Carter everything she knew about the rifle in her hands. He taught her how to read wind, how to control her breath, how to become a ghost. He taught her the exact trick she'd use to slip past the thermal on the riverbed. He'd taught her every single skill she'd used to get here tonight. And now he was standing on that platform, and he had taught her too well, because if she knew his tricks, then he knew hers, and the moment she fired, Raymond Cutter would know exactly precisely where to look. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Whitman had been wrong. This wasn't just a professional. This was the professional who had made her. Every advantage she thought she had, every clever thing she'd done to get into this position, Cutter had put in her head himself. He'd see her fingerprints on the whole operation. He'd know she came from the water because he was the one who taught her that the water was the last place anyone would look. For the first time all night, real despair reached up and grabbed her by the throat. She lay in the freezing water and she watched her old instructor scan the darkness with the same slow, patient professionalism he drilled into her. And she understood that she was not outthinking Victor Hale's shooter. She was hiding from her own teacher, and nobody had ever beaten Raymond Cutter at his own game. Nobody. Except Maya's mind, sluggish and cold and terrified, snagged on a single thread. Except she knew something Cutter didn't. She knew that he had taught her. And more than that, she knew the one lesson Cutter had never been able to teach her because it wasn't a skill, it was a flaw. She remembered it now, sitting in that classroom 3 years ago, watching him run drills. Cutter had a habit. When he was hunting, when he was truly locked onto a target, Raymond Cutter always assumed his opponent thought the way he did. It was his genius and it was his weakness. He'd model the enemy's mind, perfectly predict every move, and then he'd win because he understood them better than they understood themselves. But that only worked if the enemy thought like Cutter. And Maya suddenly understood, lying there in the dark, that her only chance was to do the one thing her teacher would never predict. She had to do something stupid, something wrong, something no sniper he had ever trained would do, because the correct move, the smart move, the move Cutter would be waiting for, was the move that would get her killed. The question was whether she could think of it before he found her first. On the platform, Hale finished his cigarette and flicked it out into the dark, and he said something to Cutter that Maya couldn't hear, and Cutter nodded and raised a pair of binoculars and began methodically to sweep the river. He was starting at the far bank. He was working his way toward her. Maya's window was closing. In 90 seconds, maybe less, those binoculars were going to reach the deep shadow where she was hiding. And Raymond Cutter, who had taught her that the darkest shadow is where the smart shooter always hides, was going to look straight into it because he knew that's exactly where his best student would be. The smart shadow, the correct hiding place, the one he taught her. That was it. That was the flaw. She was hiding exactly where Cutter had taught her to hide, and that was why he was going to find her. The lesson that had gotten her this far was now the thing that was going to kill her. She had to move. It was insane. Every instinct she had, every rule of her craft screamed at her to hold still. That movement was death, that a stationary shooter in shadow was invisible, and a moving one was a target. But those were Cutter's rules, and Cutter was counting on her to follow them. So Maya broke them. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to slide sideways through the water, out of the deep, correct textbook shadow that any sniper would choose, and into a stretch of open bank that was partially lit by the compound's lights, a place so exposed, so obviously wrong that no trained shooter would ever hide there. It was the last place Cutter would look, because it was the first place he taught her never to be. The binoculars swept across the shadow she'd just left. They lingered there. Maya watched them hold on her old hiding place for 3 full seconds, and she knew that if she'd stayed where her training told her to stay, she'd already be dead. Cutter had found the shadow. He just hadn't found her because for once in her life, she'd done the wrong thing on purpose. The binoculars moved on. Maya settled into her new terrible exposed position, her whole body trembling, and she brought her rifle up, and now she had a new problem, because from here, her firing angle on Hale was worse, longer, harder, with a tree partially blocking her line to the platform. She'd traded a good shot for her life. Now she had to make an impossible shot count, and she had to find the courage to take it while lying in the open in the light where a single glance would end her. She built the shot. 640 meters now. The wind had shifted again, quartering harder. The tree cut off part of the platform, which meant she had a window, a narrow band of open air, and Hale had to be standing in exactly the right place, and she had 1 bullet before Cutter found her muzzle flash. Hale was pacing. He moved in and out of her window, in and out, and each time he passed through it, Maya's finger tightened, and each time he passed out of it before she could commit. Her hands were barely working. The cold had stolen the fine control she needed. She flexed her frozen fingers and prayed they'd do what she asked when the moment came. And then 2 things happened at once. Hale stopped pacing, and he stopped in the exact center of her window, turning to say something to Cutter, presenting himself perfectly, a shot she would make 10 times out of 10 on any range in the world. And Raymond Cutter, sweeping his binoculars back for a second pass, stopped moving and slowly lowered them and turned his head toward the stretch of open-lit riverbank where his best student was lying exposed in a place he'd taught her never to be. He'd figured it out. She saw it happen. She saw the understanding move across his face, even at 600 meters, saw him realize that she'd done the one thing he hadn't predicted. And she saw his hand move toward his own rifle, and Maya Carter understood that she had exactly 1 second to live and one bullet to spend, and two men who both needed to die and only time for one of them. Everything her father ever taught her, everything Cutter himself had drilled into her, everything the cold river had tried and failed to take, it all came down to the single frozen heartbeat. She had a perfect shot on Hale and a dying angle on Cutter, and she chose. She swung her rifle a fraction of a degree off the man she'd come 3 miles through hell to kill off Victor Hale standing perfect and helpless in her window, and she put her crosshairs on Raymond Cutter, instead on her teacher, on the only man on that platform who could kill her. And in the last quarter second before his rifle came up, Maya Carter squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her frozen shoulder. 600 meters away, Raymond Cutter's search ended forever. And in the same instant, the sound reached the compound before the echo had even finished rolling across the water. Maya was already working the bolt, already swinging back onto her window, already hunting for Victor Hale because she'd spent her one guaranteed shot on the man who could kill her. And now she had to find the man she'd come to kill in the chaos she'd just unleashed, and she had no idea if he'd still be standing there or if he'd already dived for cover. The platform erupted. Hale was moving. Of course he was moving. The shot had shattered the night, and the man's survival instincts were flawless, and he was already lunging for the doorway for cover, for the safety of his fortress. And Maya's window showed her nothing but the empty air where he'd been standing a half-second before. No, not like this. Not after everything. She swung her rifle tracking hunting, and she caught a flash of him in the light of the door. Fraction of him, a shoulder and a turning head, an impossible shot, a shot no sane sniper would take a shot with a frozen body and a shifting wind and a target in full flight. Maya took it anyway. She didn't calculate. There was no time to calculate. She simply became, for one single instant, everything she had trained her whole life to be, every drill, every dawn on the range, every lesson from a father's silence and a teacher's cruelty, all of it collapsing into one frozen finger and one final breath, and she fired into the doorway. The running shadow of Victor Hale, for a moment nothing. Maya lay in the freezing water, her rifle empty of certainty, staring through her scope at a doorway that had swallowed her target, and she thought, I missed. God help those 8 people I missed. And then Victor Hale staggered back out of the doorway, way into the light. One hand pressed to his side, his face twisted in shock and disbelief. And he looked out at the black river with an expression Maya would remember for the rest of her life. The look of a man who had thought of everything, who had planned for every soldier and every tactic and every approach, and who had just been shot by a ghost he never believed could exist. He fell. Victor Hale went down on the platform of his own fortress, and he did not get up. The compound exploded into chaos. Men were shouting, running, firing wildly into a darkness they couldn't understand. Where is he? Where's the shooter? Where is he? The voices carried across the water, panicked, disbelieving, and Maya heard in them the exact same words that would one day become legend, the words that a dying SEAL team had whispered into their radios, the words that would follow her for the rest of her career. Who's shooting on? Where is he? They were looking at the rooftops. They were looking at the hills. They were looking everywhere a shooter was supposed to be. Not one of them looked at the river. Maya keyed the small transmitter at her throat, the one she'd been forbidden to use until this exact moment, and she spoke the only words the mission required. Her voice steady even as her body shook itself apart from the cold. Hale is down. Counter sniper is down. You're clear. Move now. Move now. 3 miles away on a cold ridgeline, Commander Ethan Brooks heard a voice he'd been certain he would never hear again crackle to life in his headset, and he closed his eyes for one single second of something too large to name. And then he opened them, and he roared the order that sent Cole Whitman and his assault team surging out of the tree line toward the compound. But down in the water, Maya's work wasn't finished, because the compound was still full of armed men, and Whitman's team was about to cross open ground to reach the lodge, and every one of those panicked, searching gunmen was a threat to the men she'd promised to open the door for. She'd told Whitman she'd get him the opening, The opening wasn't just two dead men. The opening was cover. So Maya Carter, half frozen alone, lying exposed on a lit riverbank, with a body that was actively trying to die, went back to work. She found the first gunman as he raised his weapon toward the tree line where Whitman's team was emerging. She fired. He dropped. She worked the bolt, her frozen fingers screaming, and found the second, a man in the tower, swinging a heavy machine gun toward the assault team, and she fired again, and the tower went silent. She became, in those final desperate minutes, exactly the ghost the compound feared, an unseen hand reaching out of the darknesses to strike down death after death after death. And every man she dropped was a bullet that never reached the SEALs crossing that open ground. "Who's shooting? Where is he?" The scream came again, closer to panic, now a man's voice cracking with terror. They still didn't understand. They were dying one by one to an enemy they could not see, could not find, could not even imagine, and the not knowing was breaking them faster than the bullets. Whitman's team hit the lodge. Maya heard the breach through her scope, saw the flash, saw Whitman himself go through the door she'd promised him, and she thought, "I got you the opening, Cole. Now get them out." Inside, the fight was short and vicious. Hale's men, leaderless, terrified, hunted from a darkness they couldn't comprehend, had no answer for a SEAL assault team that hit them from the front, while a ghost hit them from behind. Maya covered every window, every door, every angle she could reach, dropping any threat that showed itself, and one by one the guns inside the lodge fell silent. And then Whitman's voice came over the net, ragged and breathless, and shaking with an emotion Maya had never heard from him before. "We've got them. We've got all 8. They're alive. They're all alive. We're bringing them home." Maya Carter lay in the freezing river, her rifle finally still, and she let her forehead sink down until it touched the cold, wet earth of the bank. And for just one moment, one single private moment that no one would ever see, she let herself feel all of it. The cold, the exhaustion, the terror, the grief for a teacher she'd been forced to kill. And underneath all of it, rising up through all of it, something that felt almost like peace. 8 names, 8 people, a father of 3, a kid on his first assignment, a man whose wife was carrying a baby he might now live to meet. All 8, alive, coming home. She'd done it. But the night wasn't finished with her yet, because as the adrenaline drained out of her body, the cold finally fully claimed what the mission had been holding at bay, and Maya felt her frozen limbs simply stop answering her. Her fingers wouldn't grip, her legs wouldn't kick. The current, patient and cruel as it had been all night, felt her weakness and took hold of her and began gently to pull the ghost of the Columbia River away from the bank and out into the deep, dark, killing water. And Lieutenant Maya Carter, who had just saved 8 lives, discovered that she no longer had the strength to save her own. Sao có 3.200 từ bạn nói đúng, part 2 chưa đạt đủ 4.000 đến 4.500 từ. Tôi sẽ viết bổ sung phần cuối để hoàn thiện nối liền mạch, ngay từ chỗ Maya bị dòng nước cuốn đi, giữ nguyên phong cách không mô tả cảnh tập trung hành động và tâm lý, thêm mini climax và cliffhanger. The current took her and Maya didn't have the strength to argue with it. She felt herself sliding away from the bank, felt the deep water reach up and wrap around her legs and pull, and her body, which had obeyed her through 3 miles of hell, simply stopped listening. Her arms floated useless at her sides. Her legs hung dead in the water. She tried to kick, and nothing happened, tried to reach for the bank, and her fingers wouldn't close. And some distant clinical part of her mind noted the symptoms and delivered the verdict without emotion. Severe hypothermia. Motor function failing. You have minutes, maybe less. She thought with a strange floating calm. So this is how it ends. Not a bullet, not cutter. Just the cold the way it always wanted to. And then a hard, angry voice spoke inside her. And it wasn't hers, it was her father's, the voice from the day she told him she was joining the teams. The hard part is proving it to yourself when there's nobody left in the room to see it. There was nobody left in the room. She was alone in the deep water in the dark, exactly as she'd known she'd be, and nobody would ever know whether she fought or whether she simply let go, which was exactly why it mattered. Maya fought. She reached down into whatever was left of her past, the cold past, the exhaustion, past the seductive whisper telling her to rest, and she forced one arm to move. Just one. It came up slow and clumsy and wrong, but it came up and it found a rock on the bottom and it held. Then the other arm. Then inch by frozen inch, hand over hand, along the riverbed, she began to drag herself back toward the bank. She'd been torn from refusing with the last coal of will she had left, to let the river take the ghost after the ghost had done its job. Above her, the compound was quiet now. The shooting had stopped. Whitman had his 8. The mission was over, and everyone believed the ghost had vanished back into the darkness. The way ghosts do, and not one soul on that ridgeline or in that lodge knew that their impossible sniper was drowning 300 yards downriver alone with no one coming. Except Cole Whitman had made a promise, and Cole Whitman kept his promises. Back at the lodge, as the last of the hostages were being carried out, Reyes had grabbed Whitman by the arm. "Where's Carter?" "She said she'd exfil on her own. Downriver." Reyes's face changed. "Cole, look at that water. Look at how long she's been in it. Nobody exfils on their own after that long in cold water like a professional. Nobody." His grip tightened. "She got us in. We are not leaving her in that river." And that was how it happened, that while 8 rescued Americans were being loaded to safety, 2 SEALs went sprinting down the riverbank in the dark, sweeping the water with their lights, screaming a name into the current. "Carter, Maya, where are you, Carter?" Down in the water, Maya heard them. She heard her name faint and far away, and she thought at first it was the cold playing tricks, the way it did at the end, filling your dying mind with the voices of the people you wanted. But the voice came again closer, real angry, and it was Whitman, and he was calling for her the way she'd called for 8 strangers all night long. She tried to answer, nothing came out. Her voice was as frozen as the rest of her. She tried to raise a hand and it barely broke the surface. She had gotten herself back to the shallows through sheer stubbornness, but she had nothing left, nothing at all, and she lay there in a foot of black water, with a light sweeping toward her and no way to tell it she was there. The light passed over her, kept moving. "No," she thought, "I'm here. I'm right here." And then with the very last thing she had with a strength she didn't possess, and pulled up out of somewhere she couldn't name Maya, Carter forced her frozen hand to close around the barrel of the rifle still slung across her back, and she lifted it and she brought it down flat against the surface of the water with a single sharp slap. The light snapped back. There, Whitman's voice cracked across the dark. "In the water at the bank. I got her. Hands seized her, strong hands, warm hands dragging her up out of the water that had wanted her so badly, and Maya felt herself lifted and turned and heard Whitman's voice right against her ear, ragged and half sobbing. "I got you, Lieutenant. I got you. You're out. You're out of the water. You hear me. You did it." Maya couldn't speak, but her eyes found his face in the dark, and she held his gaze, and Cole Whitman, who 3 hours ago had wanted to put his hands around her throat, looked down at the half-dead woman in his arms and understood exactly what he was holding. "You crazy, magnificent fool," he whispered. "You actually did it." They wrapped her. They pulled the frozen gear off her and packed her in every warm thing they had, and Reyes got on the radio and called for the fastest extraction in the history of the unit. And through all of it, Maya drifted in and out, catching pieces, holding on. She heard Reyes say, her core temps dropping, "We need to move now." She heard Whitman say, "Stay with me, Carter. You did not swim through 3 miles of that river to quit on the bank. Stay with me." And she heard faintly from somewhere on the water the sound of the boats carrying 8 rescued Americans toward home, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her life, and she let herself sink into it. Safe at last, the mission done, the ghost finally allowed to rest. 3 miles away, Commander Ethan Brooks stood in the command tent and listened to Reyes's report come crackling through hostages. "Secure all 88, live hail confirmed dead. Counter sniper, confirmed dead." And one more line that made him grip the edge of the map table until his knuckles went white. "And Carter," Brooks said into the radio. "Say again about Carter." There was a pause, and then Reyes's voice, thick with something Brooks had never heard from the old Master Chief in 20 years. "Alive, Commander. We nearly lost her in the water. She'd stopped being able to move. Another 2 minutes and the river would have had her." A breath. She got the whole thing done, and then she about drowned 300 yards from where nobody was even looking, because she wouldn't call for help until every one of those hostages was clear. She wouldn't say a word about herself until the mission was done. Brooks closed his eyes. He thought about the 10 hours ago. He thought about the way he'd told her the truth, that he wasn't sure about her, that he was only sending her because he was desperate. He thought about what she'd said back, calm as anything. "I don't need you to be sure about me. I've got enough sure for both of us." and he thought about how utterly wrong he had been. "Brooks," Reyes said, "you there?" "I'm here." Brooks opened his eyes and his voice when it came was rough. "Get her home, Daniel, whatever it takes. You get that woman home." "Already moving, Commander." Brooks set down the radio and stood alone in the tent for a long moment, staring at the map at the compound that had killed two of his teams and would never kill anyone again at the black line of the river, where a single frozen woman had done what an entire unit of the finest warriors in America could not. He'd spent his whole career believing he understood what strength was. Numbers, firepower, experience. Men who'd been doing this for 20 years. He'd looked at a 29-year-old woman half the size of his operators, and he'd seen someone to doubt. And she'd walked into his darkest hour and outthought his enemy, outlasted his river, and outbraved every man on his roster. And she'd done the last of it alone in freezing water, with nobody left in the room to see it, which meant she hadn't done it for the recognition or the record or to prove any point to anyone. She'd done it for 8 strangers whose names she'd bothered to learn. Brooks was a hard man who'd seen hard things, and he was not a man who let himself be moved easily. But standing alone in that tent, listening to the boats bring 8 impossible survivors home across the water, Ethan Brooks felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept shut for a very long time. "I owe you an apology, Lieutenant," he said quietly to no one, "and I intend to pay it in full." Out on the river, wrapped in every warm thing 2 SEALs owned, carried in the arms of a man who'd sworn he'd get her the door and instead got her out of the water, Lieutenant Maya Carter finally let go the last thread of will she'd been holding onto since 2300 and slid down into a deep and dreamless dark. But her heart was still beating. And downriver, safe in the boats, 8 Americans who'd been certain their country had forgotten them were going home to the mothers and fathers and children and unborn babies who'd been praying in the dark, and not one of them yet knew the name of the ghost who'd come for them, or that she was at that very moment fighting for her own life on the bank of the same river she'd risen out of to save theirs. The ghost of the Columbia had done her job. Whether the woman inside the ghost would survive, it was a question no one could yet answer. She woke up fighting. The first thing Maya knew was that she was warm, and the warmth was wrong because the last thing she remembered was the cold, and her body came awake swinging at an enemy that wasn't there. A hand caught her wrist before she could hurt herself or anyone else, and a voice she recognized said, "Easy, Lieutenant. Easy. You're safe. You're in a hospital. It's over." Maya's eyes focused. Whitman, sitting beside a hospital bed with a 2-day beard and eyes that hadn't slept, still wearing the same fatigues from the river, like he hadn't left the building since they'd pulled her out of the water. "The hostages," she rasped. It was the first word out of her mouth. "Not where am I, not what happened to me. The 8. Whitman's face did something complicated, and then he laughed a short, broken, disbelieving laugh. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. They had to warm your blood outside your body to keep your heart going, and the first thing you ask about is the hostages." He shook his head slowly. "All 8. Home. Every single one. There's a man in Ohio holding a baby right now that he was sure he'd never meet because of you." Maya closed her eyes, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 days finally let go. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, then it was worth it." "Worth it." Whitman's voice cracked on the word. "Lieutenant, you nearly died on that bank. 2 more minutes and the river would have had you. You want to tell me why you didn't call for extraction the second hail went down? Why you kept shooting, kept covering us, kept working until you couldn't even lift your own arm?" He leaned forward. "You could have saved yourself. Why didn't you?" Maya opened her eyes and looked at him, and her answer was so simple, it took the anger right out of him. "Because you weren't clear yet," she said. "And I said I'd get you the door." Whitman sat back. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Then he scrubbed a hand down his face, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough and low. "My brother," he said, "the one Hale killed. I told you about him on the log." He swallowed hard. "His name was Danny, and the whole time we were pulling you out of that water, all I could think was, this is what Danny would have wanted. Somebody who wouldn't quit on the people they came to save." He looked at her, and there was no doubt left anywhere in his eyes. "You'd have gone back in that water for Danny, wouldn't you, if he'd been one of the 8? "Yes," Maya said without hesitation, "I would have." Whitman nodded slowly and reached out and put his big hand over hers on the hospital blanket, and neither of them said anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. The door opened and a nurse came in, and behind her, filling the doorway, was Commander Ethan Brooks. Whitman stood immediately. Brooks waved him back down without looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the woman in the bed, and Maya watched a man she'd last seen as a hard-doubting commander cross the room and stop beside her, and she saw on his face something she had never expected to see. She saw a man who didn't know what to say. "Lieutenant," Brooks began, and stopped. He'd rehearsed this, she could tell. He'd had 2 days of standing in hallways to rehearse it, and now that he was here, all the rehearsed words had gone somewhere he couldn't reach. "Sir," Maya said quietly, letting him off the hook. "It's good to see you." But Brooks shook his head. "No, let me say it. I need to say it, and you need to hear it, and I need to say it in front of witnesses, so I can't take it back." He took a breath. "In that tent, I told you I wasn't sure about you. I told you I was only sending you because I was desperate. I told you that to your face hours before you swam 3 miles through a river that should have killed you and did something no other operator in my command could do." His jaw tightened. That was the truth, as I understood it that night. But it was the truth of a fool lieutenant, and I have spent 2 days standing outside that door learning exactly how big a fool I was. "Sir, I'm not finished." Brooks's voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "I have been doing this for 26 years. I have built my whole understanding of what makes a warrior on numbers, on firepower, on experience, on men who look a certain way and move a certain way and have a certain amount of gray in their beards. And I looked at you and I saw everything you weren't, and I never once stopped to see everything you were." He paused. "You outthought the smartest enemy we've ever faced. You outlasted a river that beat 2 of my teams, and then you damn near drowned 300 yards from safety because you would not save your own life until every hostage was clear. That's not something I taught you. That's not something the Navy taught you. That's who you are, Thone." He straightened. "I owe you an apology, Lieutenant Carter. And more than that, I owe you the truth I should have seen in that tent. You didn't need me to believe in you. You were right about that, but you were owed it anyway. And I'm giving it to you now for whatever it's worth this late." The room was very quiet. Maya looked at this hard old man who had crossed a distance far longer than the one from the doorway to her bed, and she understood what it had cost him to walk it. "It's worth a great deal, sir," she said softly. "Thank you." Brooks nodded once sharply the way men do when they're afraid of what their voice will do if they say anything more. And then he did something that made even Whitman's eyes go wide. He came to attention beside her hospital bed, and Commander Ethan Brooks, 26 years in the teams, saluted a 29-year-old lieutenant lying in a bed with tubes in her arm. Maya, who could barely lift her hand, returned it as best she could. "There'll be a debrief when you're strong enough," Brooks said, dropping the salute, his voice back under control. "There'll be paperwork. There'll almost certainly be a medal, though I know you well enough already to know you won't want it." A faint, unfamiliar warmth touched the corner of his mouth. "But that's all for later. For now, Lieutenant, that is a direct order from your commanding officer. Rest. You've earned it more than any soldier I've ever commanded." He turned to go, but at the door he stopped the same way she had stopped in the tent that first night, and without turning around, he said, "For what it's worth, my daughter's 14. She wants to be a pilot. Everybody keeps telling her all the reasons she can't." He was quiet for a second. "I'm going to tell her about you. Not your name, I know I can't. But I'm going to tell her there was a soldier who did the impossible because she decided her fear didn't get a vote." Well, he finally turned his head just slightly. "Thank you for that too." And then he was gone. Maya lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes, and for a while the only sound was the soft beeping of the machines and Whitman's steady breathing beside her. She thought it was over. She thought the hard part was behind her, that all that was left was healing and paperwork and going home. She was wrong. Because 3 days later, when she was strong enough to sit up and take visitors, a man in a suit she'd never seen before walked into her hospital room, closed the door behind him, and did not smile. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "my name is Agent Reeves. I'm with a federal task force you don't have clearance to know the full name of. I need to ask you some questions about the man you killed on that platform. The one Hale called Cutter." Maya's stomach tightened. "Raymond Cutter, my old instructor." "Yes." Reeves pulled a chair up to the bed and sat, and there was something in his eyes that put her instantly on guard. "That's what we need to talk about, Because here's the thing that's keeping a lot of very important people up at night, Lieutenant. He leaned forward. Raymond Cutter wasn't supposed to be there. What do you mean he wasn't supposed to be there? I saw him. I killed him. I know you did. We have his body. Reeves paused. What I mean is that Raymond Cutter was discharged 3 years ago and dropped completely off our radar. No employment, no associations, nothing. And then he turns up as Victor Hale's personal counter-sniper in a compound holding 8 of our own intelligence officers. He let that sit. And the 8 officers Hale captured, their assignment before they were taken was investigating a leak. A serious one. Someone inside our own house has been feeding operational intelligence to people like Victor Hale for years, which is how Hale always knew exactly what our teams were going to do before they did it. The tent came back to Maya in a rush, her own voice. He's beating you because he knows exactly what you're going to do before you do it. You're saying Hale had a source, she said slowly, inside our own command. I'm saying the 8 people you rescued were about to expose that source, which is exactly why Hale took them, and exactly why he was going to execute them one by one. Reeves's voice dropped. And I'm saying that the source needed a shooter he could trust to make sure nobody got out of that compound alive. A professional. Someone off the books. Someone who'd been quietly discharged and had every reason to hate the institution that threw him out. He looked at her steadily. Someone like Raymond Cutter. Maya went cold in a way that had nothing to do with any river. You think whoever the source is, she said, recruited my old instructor. I think, Reeves said carefully, that when you put a bullet in Raymond Cutter, you didn't just save your own life and complete your mission. I think you accidentally killed the one man who could have led us to the traitor inside our own command. He paused. And I think the traitor knows that, which means the traitor knows your name and knows exactly what you did and knows that you're the loose thread on the one operation that was supposed to bury this whole thing forever. The machines beeped softly in the silence. What are you telling me? Maya asked quietly. Reeves stood and buttoned his jacket. I'm telling you, Lieutenant, that the mission you think is over isn't over. I'm telling you that somewhere above you, in the chain of command, is it a person who wanted those 8 officers dead, who wanted Victor Hale to succeed, and who now has a very good reason to want you gone before you start asking the same questions those 8 officers were asking. He walked to the door. I'm telling you to watch your back, because the enemy you can see is dead on a platform by a river. It's the one you can't see that should worry you now. He opened the door to leave and Maya's voice stopped him. Agent Reeves, he turned. Those 8 officers, Maya said, the investigation they were running. Is it dead now that they're safe, or is it still open? Reeves studied her for a long moment. It's still open, he said, but it's got no direction and no leads, and it's about to get quietly shut down by people who'd prefer it stayed buried. Why? Maya looked at him, and Whitman, sitting in the corner, saw the exact expression cross her face that he'd seen in the command tent the first night the fire underneath the calm. Because I don't like leaving a job half done, Maya said. I got 8 people out of that compound, but if there's someone who put them in it, someone who's still sitting comfortable inside our own house right now, then the job isn't finished. She met his eyes. Give me the file, the one the 8 officers were building. When I'm out of this bed, I want to see it. Reeves was quiet for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation, maybe, or the first flicker of hope he'd felt in a long time. You just spent 3 days unable to lift your own arm, he said, and you want to hunt a traitor who's protected by the entire weight of our command structure. I spent 7 hours in a river everybody said would kill me, Maya answered, to get 8 strangers home. Compared to that, Agent Reeves reading a file sounds like a vacation. For the first time since he'd walked in, something almost like a smile touched the corner of Reeves's mouth. I'll be in touch, he said, and left. The door clicked shut, and Whitman let out a long breath from his corner. You just told a spook you're going to hunt down a traitor inside our own chain of command, from a hospital bed. He shook his head. You know that's insane, right? You know that's the kind of thing that gets people quietly disappeared. Maya turned her head to look at him. You said the same word in the tent, insane, about the river. Whitman was quiet. And I came back from the river, she said. You barely came back from the river. But I came back. She looked up at the ceiling. Cole, 8 people are alive right now who were supposed to die. And the only reason they were ever in that compound is that somebody inside our own house handed them to a monster. That somebody is still out there, still in a position to do it again to the next 8 and the 8 after that. Her jaw set. I didn't swim 3 miles through freezing water to pull 8 people out of a fire just to walk away and let the man who lit it go set another one. Whitman looked at her for a long, long moment, and then slowly he stood up and he crossed the room and he sat down on the edge of her bed. "Danny," he said quietly, "my brother, he always used to say the job's not done till everybody's home and the person who took them can't take anybody else." He swallowed. "I used to think that was just something people say. Big words. Then Hale killed him, and I stopped believing anybody actually lived like that." He looked at her, and his eyes were wet. "And then I met you." He held out his hand. "When you're out of this bed," Cole Whitman said, "and you go hunting for whoever it is that put those 8 people in that compound, you're not going alone. You understand me? I got you out of that river. I'm not about to let you walk into something worse by yourself." He gripped her hand hard. "Danny's not here to finish his job, so I'll finish it with you, deal?" Maya looked at the hand and then at the man, and something in her chest that had been carrying the whole weight of everything alone for so long shifted just slightly and let a little of the weight over onto someone else. "Deal," she said and gripped his hand back. But even as she said it, a cold thought moved through the back of her mind, and it wasn't the river's cold, it was something worse. Because Reeves had said the traitor knew her name, knew what she'd done, and that meant that somewhere out there right now, someone in a uniform she was sworn to trust was looking at her file with the exact same intensity she was about to bring to theirs, and calculating the way Cutter had calculated on that platform, exactly how to make the loose thread disappear. She'd spent the whole mission being the ghost that no one could see. Now for the first time someone was hunting her, and she didn't yet know their face. 2 weeks later, Maya was discharged from the hospital, still weak, still carrying the deep bone cold that severe hypothermia leaves behind, but standing on her own 2 feet. Reeves had kept his word. There was a file waiting for her, thick and heavy, the accumulated work of 8 officers who'd spent months chasing a shadow inside their own command. And there was a small, secure room where she could read it off the books, quiet, the kind of room where things got done that the official record would never show. She read for 3 days straight, and on the 3rd day, buried deep in the file in a list of personnel who'd had access to the operational details of the 2 failed rescue attempts. The 2 attempts where Hale had known everything before it happened. Maya found something that made her go very still. Every operation Hale had known about in advance shared exactly one name in the approval chain. One person who had signed off on all of them. One person with the access, the position, and the authority to feed Victor Hale everything he needed to slaughter 2 SEAL teams. And it was a name she knew. It was a name she trusted. It was a name that had 12 days ago stood beside her hospital bed and saluted her and apologized and told her about his 14-year-old daughter who wanted to be a pilot. Maya stared at the name of Commander Ethan Brooks, and the whole world went silent around her. She sat there for a long time, the file open in her lap, her hands very still, and she felt something she hadn't felt even in the coldest depths of the river. She felt the ground move under her. It couldn't be him. It couldn't. She'd looked in his eyes. She'd seen the man cross a room and admit he'd been a fool, seen him salute her, heard the crack in his voice when he talked about telling his daughter her story. That wasn't a traitor. That was a good man who'd been wrong and had the courage to say so. But the file didn't care what she'd seen. The file only knew what it knew. And what it knew was that every single operation Victor Hale had turned into a slaughter had crossed Ethan Brooks's desk first. Maya closed the file slowly. There were 2 possibilities, and she made herself look at both of them without flinching, the way she looked at everything. Either the commander who'd apologized to her, the man who'd sent her into that river as a last desperate hope, was the traitor who'd fed 2 of his own teams to a monster. Or someone had been very, very careful to make sure that if anyone ever went looking for the leak, the trail would lead straight to Ethan Brooks and stop there. A frame. A perfect frame. The kind of frame a real traitor builds when they know that someday someone might come asking questions. The kind of frame that would only hold up if the person investigating never bothered to ask why it was so convenient. Maya stood slowly, her legs still not fully hers, and she looked at the closed file on the table, and she understood that she was standing at the edge of something far deeper and far darker than any river. Because if Brooks was innocent, then the real traitor had just handed her a loaded weapon and was counting on her to fire it at the wrong man. And the moment she accused Ethan Brooks, the moment she pointed the investigation at him, the real enemy would slip quietly out the back while everyone was looking the other way. And if Brooks was guilty, if the man who'd saluted her was the man who'd murdered two teams, then she was completely, utterly alone with no one above her she could trust, hunting the most dangerous kind of enemy there is, the kind who wears the same uniform you do and calls you by your rank and looks you in the eye and lies. Maya picked up the file and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the knob. She thought about her father. The hard part is proving it to yourself when there's nobody left in the room to see it. There was nobody left in the room now. Nobody she could be sure of. Not Brooks. Maybe not even Reeves. She was back in the black water, alone in the dark, with the current pulling at her and no one coming. But she'd learned something in that river that no one could ever take from her. She could hold her breath and her nerve longer than anybody thought was possible. Maya opened the door and stepped out into a hallway that suddenly felt full of hidden eyes, and she began quietly, carefully, the most dangerous hunt of her life, not knowing whether the man she was hunting was the enemy who'd sent her into hell or an innocent man she was being maneuvered into destroying, and knowing only that 8 people were home and 2 teams were dead, and somebody in a uniform she was sworn to trust was going to have to answer for it, whoever it was, whatever it cost. Part 4 lưu ý Việt đủ 5.000 đến 5.500 từ, liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng, đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc, chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần tiếp đặc điểm 10/10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lỗi AI kể theo, ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ, kịch tính không Việt lầm. Man kết thúc, phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mức document mới. 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đạt 10 đến 15 mini climax, mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 10. 2 phút có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả, thêm đánh dấu thời gian. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, không có phần gạch. Trong bài viết, viết văn bản phù hợp với TTS và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nha. Show more, she didn't go to Reeves. That was the first decision, and it was the hardest one because every instinct in her body wanted to walk straight into that federal agent's office and drop the file on his desk and say, "Here, it's Brooks, I found him." But Maya had learned something in that river that had kept her alive when the smart move would have killed her. Sometimes the correct thing, the obvious thing, the thing everyone expects you to do, is exactly the trap. Reeves had handed her a file. Reeves had told her to hunt, and the file led cleanly and conveniently to one name. Maybe that was because Brooks was guilty, or maybe that was because someone wanted her to think he was. So Maya sat alone in her small apartment that night with the file spread across her kitchen table, and she did the one thing a frame counts on nobody having the patience to do. She checked the work. She stopped looking at the conclusion the file was pushing her toward, and she started looking at who had assembled the file and how and when. And within an hour, she found the first crack. The list of personnel with access to the 2 failed operations. The list where every trail led to Brooks had been compiled by the 8 officers before they were captured. That much was real. But the version in Maya's hands wasn't their original. It was a copy that had been made after they were taken, after they were already in Hale's compound by someone with access to the secure system who'd had the file in their hands for 2 full weeks before Reeves ever handed it to her. 2 weeks. Plenty of time to add a name to a list. Plenty of time to make sure every trail led exactly where you wanted it to lead. Maya's hands went still on the table. She called Whitman at 2 in the morning. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting. "I need you to find something for me," she said, "and I need you to do it without going through official channels, and I need you to understand before you say yes that if I'm right about what's happening, doing this could get us both killed." There was a pause on the line, then Whitman's voice calm and certain. "What do you need?" She almost laughed. No hesitation, not even a breath of it. "I need the original access list from the 2 failed operations. Not the copy in the investigation file. The original from the raw system logs before anybody had a chance to touch it." She paused. The file Reeves gave me points at Commander Brooks, but the version I'm holding was copied 2 weeks after the 8 officers were taken. Somebody had it alone for 14 days, Cole. I need to know if Brooks's name was on the real list, or if somebody put it there. Whitman was quiet for a moment. You're saying Brooks might be innocent. I'm saying I don't know yet, and I'm saying that the fact that the file is so sure is exactly what's making me unsure. She rubbed her eyes. In the river Cole, the thing that saved my life was doing the wrong thing on purpose because Cutter had taught me to expect the right thing. Somebody built this file to lead me straight to Brooks, which means Brooks is either the answer or he's the shadow I'm supposed to be staring at while the real shooter moves. Give me 2 days, Whitman said, and hung up. He got it in one. The next night he showed up at her door with a thumb drive and a face like a man who'd seen a ghost, and he didn't even wait to sit down before he said it. The original list doesn't have Brooks on it. Maya went very still. His name's not there, Maya, not on either operation. On the real system logs, the raw ones, Ethan Brooks never had access to the operational details of the 2 failed rescues. Somebody added him to the copy. Whitman set the drive on the table like it was a live grenade. You were right, it's a frame. Somebody spent 2 weeks building a beautiful, clean, convenient trail straight to your commanding officer, and they handed it to the one person they were sure would follow it. You. Maya sank into a chair. Relief and dread hit her at the same moment in equal measure. Brooks was innocent. The man who'd saluted her, who'd apologized, who'd talked about his daughter, was exactly the man she'd hoped he was. But if Brooks was innocent, then the real traitor was still out there. And the real traitor had access to the secure system, had the file for 2 weeks, had the authority to hand it to Reeves, and had known with perfect certainty that Maya Carter would take the bait. Which meant the real traitor knew her, knew how she thought, knew she wouldn't let a job go half done, knew she'd read that file cover to cover and go hunting the name it pointed at. Cole, Maya said slowly. Who gave the file to Reeves? Whitman frowned. Reeves is the task force, I assumed. Reeves said he was with a federal task force I don't have clearance to know the full name of. He said the investigation had no direction and was about to be quietly shut down. Maya's mind was moving fast now, cold and clear the way it went right before a shot. But somebody handed Reeves that doctored file. Somebody above him. Somebody who wanted this whole thing to end with Brooks taking the fall and the real leak walking away clean. She stood up and started pacing the file spread out behind her. Think about it. The 8 officers were about to expose the leak, so the leak arranges for Hale to take them to bury them. But the rescue attempts keep coming and the leak can't have them succeed, so the leak feeds Hale the plans and 2 teams die. She stopped. And then I come along, the wild card, the one operation nobody could have leaked because nobody planned it in advance. I go through the river and I do the thing nobody expected, and suddenly the 8 officers are free, and worse than that, Cutter's dead. Cutter, who was the real traitor's hired gun. Cutter, who could have named them. Whitman's face was going pale. So now the traitor's got a problem. The officers are alive. Cutter's dead, but he can't be traced back to them, at least not fast. And there's a loose thread, a sniper who won't stop pulling. Me, Maya nodded. So they need to point me at something. Give me a target. Get me to burn myself down accusing an innocent man, discredit the whole investigation, and quietly close the book. She looked at Whitman. The frame wasn't just to protect the traitor. It was to destroy me. Because if I stand up and accuse Ethan Brooks and it turns out he's clean, I'm finished. Nobody ever believes the paranoid lieutenant again. The investigation dies, and the real traitor walks. The apartment was dead silent. So we don't accuse Brooks, Whitman said slowly. No, Maya said. We do something much more dangerous. She looked at him, and there was that fire again, the one Brooks had seen in the tent, the one that had frightened him. We let them think it worked. Whitman stared at her. What? They're watching me, Cole. They have to be. They handed me a poisoned file, and they're waiting to see if I take the shot at Brooks. So I waited. Her voice was steady. I go to Reeves. I tell him I've found my man. I tell him it's Commander Brooks, and I've got the file to prove it. I let the whole thing move forward exactly the way they designed it to. You want to accuse an innocent man, the man who saluted you. I want to make the real traitor believe they've won, Maya said. Because a person who thinks they've won stops being careful. They relax. They come out of the shadow to enjoy it. And the moment they do, I'll be watching for them the same way I watched that compound from the river. She held his eyes. The only way to catch a ghost coal is to make them think there's nobody left looking. Whitman sat down heavily. And Brooks, you'd let him twist in the wind, let them come for him. No, Maya's voice softened. That's the part I can't do without you. She crouched down in front of him. Because before I do any of this, Brooks has to know. He has to know it's a trick, that I know he's innocent, that I'm using his name as bait to draw out the person who tried to bury him. And he has to agree to it, knowing that for a while, maybe a long while, it's going to look like his own men turned on him. She paused. I need you to get me to him, quietly. No official channels. Nobody watching. I have to tell the man I'm about to publicly accuse of treason that I'm doing it to save him, and I have to ask him to trust me. Whitman was quiet for a long moment. The last time you asked somebody to trust you, he said, it was a whole tent full of men who buried their friends that week. And you asked them to hand a mission to one bullet. And you were right. He stood up. I'll get you to Brooks. They met him 3 nights later in the last place anyone would look, a diner off a county road 40 miles from any base, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee pot that had been on the burner since the Nixon administration. Brooks was already there when they arrived, sitting alone in the back corner in civilian clothes, and Maya saw immediately that the man had aged 10 years in the weeks since the hospital. He looked up as she slid into the booth across from him, and his face was grim. I know why you're here, Lieutenant, Brooks said before she could speak. I know what's in that file. I know my name's all over it. His hands were flat on the table, very still. I've spent 26 years in this uniform, and I have never once betrayed it, but I know exactly what those access logs look like, and I know I can't prove a negative. His voice was low and steady, a man who'd made his peace with something terrible. So if you're here to arrest me, or to tell me you're recommending charges, I understand. You're doing your job. It's the job I sent you to do. He almost smiled. I just want you to know before you do it. It wasn't me. Whatever they've built, whatever it says, it wasn't me. Maya looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. Brooks blinked. Whatever he'd braced himself for, it wasn't that. Your name's not on the original list, sir, Maya said quietly. The real system logs the raw ones before anybody touched them. Cole pulled them. You never had access to the operational details of the 2 failed rescues. Somebody added your name to a copy of the file 2 weeks after the 8 officers were taken, and then made sure that copy landed in my hands. She leaned forward. You didn't betray anyone, Commander. Someone tried very hard to make it look like you did, and they're still out there. She watched a man who'd walked into that diner ready to lose everything, his career, his freedom, his good name, slowly understand that he was being offered his life back, and she watched his composure, the thing he'd held together with both hands, finally crack. His eyes went wet, his jaw worked. And Ethan Brooks, 26 years in the teams, put one hand over his mouth for a moment and looked away out the dark window because he couldn't let even these two see his face. I have a daughter, he finally said, his voice rough. 14, she wants to be a pilot. And the last 3 weeks, all I could think about was how she was going to grow up hearing that her father was a traitor who fed his own men to a monster. He turned back and his eyes were fierce and bright. You have no idea what you just gave me back, Lieutenant. I need to take something from you first, sir, Maya said, and I need you to give it freely knowing what it means. She laid it out for him, all of it. The frame, the bait, the plan to accuse him publicly to let the real traitor believe they'd won, to draw them out of the shadow. And she watched Brooks understand, piece by piece, that she was asking him to let the world believe he was guilty for however long it took, so that she could catch the person who'd made him look that way. When she finished, Brooks was silent for a long time. You're asking me, he said slowly, to let my men look at me like I'm the one who killed their brothers, to let my daughter hear it, to sit there and take it and not defend myself and trust that a lieutenant I doubted 3 weeks ago is going to pull me out of the fire before it burns me down. Yes, sir, Maya said. That's exactly what I'm asking. Brooks looked at her and something passed across his face, and then incredibly he laughed, a short, disbelieving, broken laugh. In that tent, he said, you told me I didn't need to be sure about you. You said you had enough sure for both of us. He shook his head slowly. You have no idea how right you were, Lieutenant. No idea. He put his hand flat on the table again, But this time, it wasn't the stillness of a man making peace with the end. It was the stillness of a man deciding to fight. Do it. Use my name. Let them think they've won. I've spent 26 years asking men to trust me and follow me into fire. His voice was iron now. For once in my life, I'll do the following. I'll follow you. And so it began. Maya went to Reeves the next morning and she gave the performance of her life. She laid out the file, the access logs, the trail that led to Commander Ethan Brooks, and she watched Reeves's face, watched it carefully hunting for the things she needed to see. And she saw it. A flicker. The tiniest flicker of satisfaction quickly hidden when she named Brooks as her man. Reeves was in on it. Maybe not the top, maybe just a piece, but he was in on it, and the flicker told her everything. You're certain, Reeves said. I'm certain, Maya lied, meeting his eyes without a tremor. It's Brooks. It was always Brooks. Every operation Hale knew about crossed his desk. He fed 2 teams to that animal, and he was going to let the 8 officers die to keep it buried. She let her voice go hard with a grief she didn't feel. I want him brought up on charges. I want it done fast before he realizes we're on to him and runs. Reeves nodded slowly, and there it was again, that flicker deeper this time. You've done extraordinary work, Lieutenant. I'll take this up the chain immediately. He stood. Some very senior people are going to want to thank you personally for closing this. And that was the sentence that gave her the ghost. Some very senior people are going to want to thank you personally. Because a frame this careful, a leak, this protected, an investigation this easily steered, didn't come from an Agent Reeves. Reeves was a tool. Someone above him, someone senior, someone with the authority to hand a task force a doctored file and shut an investigation down and make a decorated commander disappear was pulling the strings. And now they wanted to meet her, to thank her, to take the measure of the loose thread and make sure it was really finally tied off. Maya smiled at Reeves and said she'd be honored. The meeting was set for 4 days later at a secure facility with a small group of senior officials who wanted to personally congratulate the sniper who'd saved 8 lives and unmasked a traitor. Maya spent those 4 days doing exactly what she'd done in the river. Preparing, waiting, controlling her breathing. And on the 4th day, she walked into a quiet wood-paneled room to shake the hands of the people who'd praised her and to find somewhere among them the face of the person who'd tried to destroy her. There were 5 of them, senior, decorated, the kind of faces that hang on walls. And Maya moved among them, shaking hands, accepting thanks, saying the right things, and the whole time she was reading them, the way she'd read the compound, the way she'd read the platform hunting for the tell. She found it in the 4th handshake. An admiral, silver-haired, warm-eyed, with a grip like a politician and a smile like a knife wrapped in a flag. And as he took her hand and thanked her for her service and her sacrifice, he said one thing too many. That was quite a shot, the admiral said warmly, taking Raymond Cutter before he could compromise the operation. Your old instructor, I understand. That couldn't have been easy. And Maya smiled and thanked him, and inside everything went cold and still and certain. Because she had never told anyone that Cutter was her instructor. Not Reeves, not in any report. The connection between her and Raymond Cutter existed in exactly one place, an old sniper course roster 3 years buried, the kind of detail only someone digging very deep into her personal history would ever find. The kind of detail someone would only bother to dig up if they'd been studying her, hunting her, the way she'd hunted the compound. The Admiral knew Cutter was her instructor. The Admiral had studied her. The Admiral was the ghost. Maya held his gaze and held his hand and kept the smile on her face through sheer brutal discipline. The same discipline that had kept her still on the riverbed while a boat full of killers passed overhead. Because she'd found him. After everything, she'd found the man at the top of it all. The man who'd fed 2 teams to Victor Hale, who'd tried to murder 8 officers to protect himself, who'd built a beautiful frame around an innocent commander and handed it to her like a gift. And he was standing right in front of her, thanking her, absolutely certain he'd won. It wasn't easy, sir, Maya said, her voice perfectly even, but some jobs you finish no matter what they cost. That's the spirit that wins wars, Lieutenant, the Admiral said, and clapped her on the shoulder and moved on to the next person. Never knowing that in that single sentence about Raymond Cutter, he'd stepped into her window the exact way Victor Hale had stepped into it on the platform by the river. He'd shown himself. And Maya Carter, the ghost of the Columbia, was very, very good at waiting for the moment a target showed himself. She left the facility that afternoon and drove straight to the diner off the county road, and Whitman and Brooks were already there, and she slid into the booth and said 4 words that changed everything. "I know who it is." Brooks went rigid. "Who?" Maya told them. The name, the rank, the silver hair, and the flag-wrapped smile. And she watched Brooks's face go through shock and disbelief, and then slowly a terrible dawning recognition, because he knew the man had served under him, had respected him for years. "That's not possible," Brooks whispered. "He's Maya. That man is untouchable. He's got the ear of people I can't even name. You can't accuse a man like that. Nobody would believe it. He'd bury you so deep they'd never find the hole." "I know," Maya said calmly. "That's exactly why the frame was so careful. That's exactly why they chose you, sir, a commander with a clean record but no protection. You were expendable. He isn't." She looked at both of them. "We can't accuse him. He's right, nobody would believe it, and the moment we tried, he'd make all 3 of us disappear and finish burning the investigation to the ground." "Then what?" Whitman said. "If we can't touch him, what do we do?" Maya was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing she'd been thinking the whole drive back, the thing that was either the most dangerous idea of her life or the only one that could work. "We don't accuse him," she said. "We make him accuse himself. The same way he made a slip about Cutter, we build a situation where the only way for him to protect himself is to reach out and do something that proves he's guilty. We give him a reason to move, and when he moves, we make sure the right people are watching." She looked at Brooks. "He thinks he's won, sir. He thinks the investigation's closing the loose threads tied off and an innocent man's taking the fall. That's the most dangerous a man like him will ever be, because he's about to stop being careful." Her jaw set. And a target who stops being careful is a target that steps into the window. The 3 of them sat in that cracked vinyl booth in the dark diner off the county road, and Maya laid out the trap piece by piece, the most audacious thing any of them had ever heard, a plan to catch an untouchable man by giving him exactly enough rope and exactly enough confidence to hang himself. It was insane. It was reckless. It depended entirely on trusting one person to be behind one single impossible play. And when she finished, Brooks looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Whitman, and then he looked back at the 29-year-old lieutenant he'd once doubted. And he said the only thing there was left to say. "You know," Brooks said slowly, "the last time somebody told me a plan this crazy would work, I told her I wasn't sure about her." A grim smile touched his mouth. "I'm not making that mistake twice, Lieutenant. What do you need me to do?" What Maya needed was a lie big enough to make an untouchable man reach out and touch it. The plan was simple in the way that the most dangerous things are simple. Brooks would let it be known quietly through the same channels the traitor was already listening on that he wasn't going to go down without a fight. That before they charged him, he'd remembered something. That one of the 8 rescued officers had left behind a file, a real one, an insurance file hidden somewhere that named the actual leak, and that Brooks knew where it was. It was bait with a hook the Admiral couldn't refuse, because if such a file existed, it was the one thing on Earth that could destroy him. He'd have no choice. He'd have to move to get it before Brooks could use it. And the moment he reached out, the moment he sent someone or came himself, he'd step out of the shadow he'd hidden in for years. "There's just one problem," Whitman said when Maya laid it out. "The second the Admiral hears Brooks has a file that names him, he doesn't send someone to steal it. He sends someone to kill Brooks and make the file disappear along with him." He looked at her. "You're not setting a trap. You're painting a target on the commander's back." "I know," Maya said quietly. Brooks looked at her across the diner booth. "You want him to send a shooter after me?" "I want him to try," Maya said. "Because a man that careful, that protected, will never expose himself for anything less than his own survival. The file is the only thing that threatens his survival. So he'll come for it. He'll send his best. And when that shooter moves on you, sir, that's the moment we finally have him doing something we can prove something with his fingerprints on it in front of the right witnesses." She held his gaze. "But it only works if you're willing to be the bait. Really be it. Standing in the open knowing there's a rifle coming." The table was silent. Brooks was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "In that river, when you took your firing position, you were bait too, weren't you? Lying out in the open where Cutter would never look, betting your life on him not finding you." "Yes, sir. And you're asking me to do the same thing. Stand in the open, Trust that you'll be there in the dark watching before the shooter can pull the trigger. Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm asking. Brooks looked at her for a long, long moment, and then slowly a grim smile spread across his face. Then I guess it's my turn to trust the person behind the bullet, he said. Set the trap, Lieutenant. I'll be the bait. And God help whoever the Admiral sends because they're going to walk into you. They set it in motion the next day. The word went out through the channels they knew were compromised. Commander Brooks, facing charges, had gone quiet, gone to ground at an isolated cabin to prepare his defense, and had told exactly one person that he'd recovered a file naming the real traitor, a file he intended to hand to federal investigators in 72 hours. It was just loose enough to travel, just specific enough to terrify, and then they waited. They didn't wait long. 30 hours after the word went out, Maya was in position. She'd chosen the ground herself the way she'd chosen the bend in the river. A cabin in open country with one road and long sight lines, and exactly one place a professional shooter would set up to take a target through the cabin's front window. She knew it was the spot because it was the correct spot, the smart spot, the textbook spot, the exact kind of position Raymond Cutter had trained her to choose, which meant it was the exact kind of position the Admiral's shooter would choose too. So Maya didn't set up there. She set up 300 meters behind it in a place no sane sniper would pick over watching the Overwatch hunting the hunter, because she'd learned the lesson in the river and she was never going to unlearn it. The way to beat a professional wasn't to be a better professional. It was to do the one thing the professional would never expect. Inside the cabin, Brooks moved past the front window on schedule, a living target, a man betting his life on a lieutenant he couldn't see. Whitman was with him, low and out of sight, a pistol in his hand, whispering into a radio. You in position, Maya. In position, Maya breathed. Hold him steady. Let the shooter see him. Don't rush it. And then she settled into her stillness, and she waited, and the old familiar cold crept into her the way it always did, and she welcomed it like an old friend, because the cold meant she was exactly where she was supposed to be. An hour passed. Then at the edge of her scope, in the exact textbook position she'd known he'd choose, a shadow shifted. Maya's whole body went to ice water calm. She watched the shape resolve, a man prone, a rifle settling into the perfect firing position to take Ethan Brooks through the cabin window. A professional, patient, good, and utterly, completely unaware that 300 meters behind him, a ghost was watching him line up his shot. I've got him, Maya breathed into the radio. He's setting up. Cole, get the commander down and get the recording going. When I tell you, and only when I tell you. Because this was the part that mattered. She wasn't going to kill the shooter. A dead shooter proved nothing, named no. No one protected the Admiral perfectly. She needed the shooter alive, and she needed him talking, and she needed federal witnesses hearing every word. Reeves was compromised, but Maya had spent the last 4 days quietly finding the people above Reeves who weren't the ones who'd been as frustrated by the buried investigation as she was. They were parked a mile down the road right now, listening, waiting. The shooter's finger moved toward his trigger. Now, Cole, Maya said. Inside the cabin, Brooks dropped. And in the same instant, Maya fired, but not at the man. She fired into the dirt 6 inches from the shooter's face, a round that kicked earth into his eyes and told him with absolute clarity that everything had just gone wrong, that he was not the hunter that he had never been, the hunter that someone was behind him with a rifle, and the next round would not miss. The shooter froze. Don't move. Maya's voice came over a loudspeaker Whitman had rigged calm and cold across the open ground. You are in the crosshairs of the sniper who took Raymond Cutter through a doorway at 600 meters in the dark. You know that name. You know what I can do. Put your hands where I can see them, or the next round goes exactly where the last one didn't. For 3 long seconds, nothing. Then the shooter's hands came off the rifle and rose slowly into the air. They took him alive. And here was where Maya's real genius showed, because she'd known the whole time that a hired professional would never give up the Admiral out of loyalty or fear. So she didn't ask him to. Instead, with the federal witnesses now surrounding him, she looked the shooter in the eye and told him the truth. The man who sent you is an admiral who has spent his whole career making sure people like you take the fall while he stays clean, she said. You're the fingerprints. You're the loose end. The second you were done here, you'd have been the next Raymond Cutter, another expendable shooter with a bullet waiting the moment you stopped being useful. She let it land. I'm not asking you to be loyal. I'm asking you to be smart. He was going to bury you the same way he buried everyone else. So you can go down alone protecting a man who was about to have you killed, or you can hand us the man who's been treating you like garbage this whole time." She paused. "Your choice, but make it now." The shooter looked at the federal agents. He looked at the rifle he'd been sent to die behind. And Maya watched the exact moment a professional killer did the math and understood she was right. He talked. He gave them everything. The admiral, the payments, the instructions, the whole chain laid out for federal investigators who'd been trying to reach the top of it for years and had never had a thread that led there. And it was all recorded, all witnessed, all beyond the admiral's power to bury, because it wasn't a paranoid lieutenant's accusation anymore. It was a confession from the admiral's own shooter, corroborated by the doctored file, the original logs, and the frame around an innocent commander. The admiral was arrested 6 hours later. Maya wasn't there to see it. She'd asked not to be. But Whitman told her about it afterward in the same diner off the county road. And he said that when they came for the silver-haired man, with the flag-wrapped smile, the man who'd been so certain he'd won, he'd looked genuinely, completely bewildered, like a man who could not comprehend how the loose thread he'd tied off so carefully had reached all the way up and pulled him down. He asked how. Whitman said, right at the end, he looked at the agents and he said how. How did anyone even get to me? Whitman shook his head slowly. They told him, a sniper, the one who came out of the river. And you know what he said? What did he say? Maya asked quietly. He said, I studied her. I studied everything about her girl. I knew exactly how she'd think. Whitman looked at her across the booth. And then one of the agents said, that was your mistake, Admiral. You studied how a professional thinks. She's not a professional. She's something else. Maya said nothing for a moment. She thought about the river. She thought about doing the wrong thing on purpose, sliding out of the smart shadow into the exposed light, because Cutter had taught her that the smart move was the trap. She thought about how the Admiral, like Cutter, like Hale, had built his whole certainty on the belief that he understood how his enemy would think, and how every one of them had died or fallen because of the one thing they never accounted for, that she'd rather do the impossible than the expected. He wasn't wrong, Maya finally said. He did understand how a professional thinks. That was the problem. I keep meeting men who've mastered every rule of the game, and they can't understand why they keep losing to someone who's willing to break them. She looked out the window. Hale planned for every soldier. Cutter trained me to hide in the smart shadow. The Admiral studied how I'd think, and every one of them lost because the thing they never planned for wasn't a better version of themselves. It was someone who was willing to be wrong on purpose if that's what it took to be right in the end. The fallout moved fast after that. The Admiral's arrest cracked open a network that had been feeding operational intelligence to men like Victor Hale for the better part of a decade. 2 dead SEAL teams finally had an answer for how the enemy had always known they were coming. 8 rescued officers, the ones who'd started it all, finally saw the investigation they'd been taken and nearly killed for Reach, the man at the top of it. And Commander Ethan Brooks, who had spent weeks believing his own daughter would grow up hearing her father was a traitor, was cleared fully publicly, completely. He came to find Maya a week later. He didn't come in uniform. He came as a man, and he sat down across from her, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Then he reached into his jacket and set a photograph on the table. A 14-year-old girl in a flight suit grinning at a camera standing next to a small plane. Her first solo, Brooks said, 2 days ago. She's been walking on air ever since. His voice was thick. She's going to be a pilot lieutenant. Everybody told her all the reasons she couldn't, and she's going to do it anyway. He looked up. I told her about you, not your name, I can't. But I told her there was a soldier who did the impossible 3 times over, who saved 8 lives and cleared her father's name and brought down a man everybody said was untouchable, and who did all of it because she decided her fear didn't get a vote. He pushed the photograph a little closer to her. I want you to have this, so that when the days are hard, and they will be, you'll remember there's a girl in the sky right now who's braver because you existed, even if she'll never know your name. Maya looked at the photograph for a long time. The girl in the flight suit, the grin, the small plane, and something in her chest, the thing that had been carrying all of this alone for so long, finally quietly set down its weight. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Don't thank me. Brooks stood. In that tent, I told you I wasn't sure about you. He put on his cap. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life, and I've never been more grateful to be wrong. It has been the honor of my career to be proven a fool by you, Lieutenant Carter. And if I ever get the chance to follow you into fire again, I'll count myself lucky. He came to attention and he saluted her, and this time Maya was strong enough to stand and return it two soldiers in a roadside diner, one who'd doubted and one who'd never needed his belief. Both of them changed by a night on a river neither would ever forget. Then Brooks was gone, and it was just Maya and the photograph in the quiet. Months later, she went back to the river. She stood on the bank where Whitman and Reyes had pulled her half dead from the water, and she looked at the current moving past, patient and cold and endless. The same water that had tried so hard to kill her. The same water she'd risen out of to save 8 strangers she'd never met. It looked so ordinary in the daylight, just a river. Nobody walking past would ever guess what had happened here, that a whole legend had been born in this water on a freezing night, that men had died and men had been saved, and a ghost had risen and a traitor had fallen, all of it starting right here on this quiet bend. That was the thing people never understood about the story, the version that spread through the teams in whispers growing taller with every telling. The ghost sniper who rose from the river, the impossible shot in the dark, the woman who did what an entire unit could not. They told it like it was a myth, like it was about some legendary marksman who wasn't quite real. But Maya knew the truth, and the truth was simpler and better. The ghost was never a myth. The ghost was a soldier, a daughter of a Marine who taught her that the hard part is proving it to yourself when there's nobody left in the room to see it. A woman who'd carried fear and pain and doubt into the coldest water of her life and had chosen duty anyway, not because she was fearless, but because she decided a long time ago that fear didn't get to make her decisions. She thought about the 8 of them home now, with their families, the father in Ohio holding the baby he was sure he'd never meet. She thought about Brooks's daughter in the sky. She thought about Whitman, who'd made a promise on a log and kept it in a river. And she thought about the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her career, the words a dying team had spoken into their radios, the words that would echo through the teams for years to come. Who's shooting? Where is he? They'd never known. That was the whole point. The person who saved them was the one they never saw, the one nobody believed in, the one who did her work in silence and asked for nothing in return. And that Maya had come to understand was exactly what made her a warrior. Not the shooting, not the medals she refused, not the legend that grew in the telling. It was this, that when nobody believed she could do it, when there was nobody left in the room to see it, when the smart thing and the safe thing and the expected thing all told her to quit, she chose duty anyway. And she did it not to prove anything to anyone, but because 8 people were counting on someone to come, and she decided she'd rather die in a river, reminding them they weren't forgotten, than live her whole life knowing she'd stayed dry. Maya Carter looked at the water one last time. Then she turned and she walked away from the river, back toward whatever came next, a soldier, a daughter, a teammate, a woman who carried her fear like a passenger and never once let it drive. And somewhere in the teams that night and for years after, when the youngest operators asked about the ghost who rose from the river, the old hands would lower their voices and tell them the truth that mattered more than any legend. True warriors are not defined by how loudly they announce their strength. They are defined by what they do when nobody believes they can succeed. Lieutenant Maya Carter had proven that in the coldest, blackest water of her life, alone with nobody left in the room to see it. And that is why long after the medals were forgotten, and the names were classified, and the legend had grown too tall to be believed, one truth remained carved into the memory of every soldier who ever heard the story. The person nobody sees is the one who saves everyone.